Hey, what's going on? It's Dave Duford here at buylifeinsuranceforburial.com and Final Expense Agent Mentor at feagentmentor.com. And today I am doing a quick live stream on a common topic that I get both from insurance agents that work with me and sell final expense, but also from consumers that are possibly interested in buying some kind of protection to pay for final expenses. And the question that I get a lot is, what is the difference between the kind of insurance that you can find at a funeral home through a funeral director versus all the stuff they get in the mail and through insurance agents like ourselves that are what's called final expense policy? So the goal of today's training is really twofold. So if you're an insurance agent or if you are a consumer and you're looking at learning the difference between both, or you're looking at possibly buying one kind of plan versus another, this is going to be perfect training for you. So I hope this is valuable for you. So getting started, what I'm going to do is first talk about how the differences are between final expense insurance and pre-need plans work. As I get my images up here, this is all done live, so everything is catching up as we speak. So let's go ahead and start with pre-need plans. And what I'm going to do is describe how they work. I'm going to describe how final expense works after that, then talk about the pros and the cons of each, and then kind of give you a general recommendation, depending on the scenario, what I would think would be a good idea or opportunity for you to select. As you're watching this, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to list them in the live chat below, or if you're watching after this recording is done, feel free to just post them down below in the comment box. I'll be happy to get back with you for anything that needs clarification. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with how pre-need insurance works. So let's define what pre-need insurance is. Pre-need insurance is what you buy through a funeral home. A funeral director usually sits down with the people interested in protecting against paying for expenses out of their pocket from their savings or having their family having to pay for that. It is an insurance policy. It's what's called, in most cases, a paid-up type of plan. What we commonly see in the field are paid-up plans that are done in 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, or 10 years, although it's completely conceivable to just pay the whole thing up immediately. The policy, that what's unique about it, is you can actually lock in certain aspects of the funeral ahead of time. And the biggest motivation behind doing this is to fight the onslaught of the effect of inflation against what funeral costs charge. If you look at, I believe it's the National Funeral Directors Association, if you look at the price change based on their metrics from 2005 to 2015, the price rose, I believe it was 25% on average for the average funeral across the nation. Now, I have some feelings about that. It can vary dramatically depending on what you select and what you don't select. But it can't be denied that there is some level of expense increase in most funerals around the country. So there's a big interest in fighting against inflation when it comes to paying for either a burial or a cremation. We see the same thing in cremation as well, which is why a lot of people go that route to lower their price. A lot of people are concerned by going to the funeral home. Does that mean I have to use that funeral home? What if ownership changes? What if their practices are not something I'd really want to go to? Let's say something horrible happens, like down at the Tri-State Funeral Home, if you've never heard about in Noble, Georgia, about 15 years ago. I'm sure you remember that. What if I don't want to go there? Or what if it closes down? Well, these are all insurance policies that these pre-need plans are derived through. So even though you're going to the funeral home, which you probably are going to want to use if nothing else changes, if something changes, the worst case scenario happens, it is an insurance policy, and it's portable to other insurance or other funeral homes anyway. So there's a lot of peace of mind, especially for someone who is a snowbird that travels down to Florida or Arizona, stays there 6 months out of the year, comes back up north. They may die down there, they may die up here, who knows, but the pre-need plan protects against that, so that's definitely a benefit. And lastly, pre-need plans typically are simplified issue underwriting. What that means is there's no medical exams, you don't have to get stuck with a needle, you don't have to pee in a cup, you just have to answer some basic questions and go through some basic underwriting. There is underwriting involved, but it's usually not very complex, like if you were to get a typical fully underwritten life insurance plan. So that's pre-need plans. We'll go into some of the pros and cons and more as a deep dive here in a minute. Now we're going to talk about how final expense insurance works. This is what I sell. This is what I train agents to sell. And there's definitely some differences between pre-need insurance and final expense insurance as a consumer. So let's hit on a couple of those. So most of these plans, whereas pre-need plans are paid up plans, most final expense plans are what we call life pay plans. There's a good reason for this. We'll cover it in a minute. But the idea behind it is you pay until you die. That's how probably 95% of the final expense plans are sold. In order to get the best price, you have to pay until the day that you die. Because if you got something paid up, usually costs a lot more. Again, we'll get into that shortly. Also, just like pre-need, it's simplified underwriting, so there's usually not medical exams involved with a real final expense carrier, just a couple year look back on most health issues. The pricing, however, because the final expense plan itself is not necessarily a funeral plan. So let me explain. We don't sell and don't call it a funeral plan specifically because we're not funeral directors and we don't sell it within the funeral home. So what happens is most people buy this and then assign a beneficiary that is a loved one, whereas with pre-need, usually it's the funeral home. So what does this mean? Well, it means the beneficiary can choose how they want to spend the money that comes from the death benefit upon your passing. So most of the time, the vast majority of the time, people buy final expense coverage to pay for the burial or cremation or any kind of related final expenses. However, a benefit of the final expense plan, it can be used for anything that you'd like a typical life insurance plan. There are people I've sold insurance to that bought it specifically to leave money behind as a legacy to their loved ones or replace income when they pass away to their surviving spouse. These are the things we can do with a final expense plan that you may not necessarily be able to do with a pre-need plan. Now, in exchange with that, the disadvantage, I guess one of the disadvantages is because this is not assigned through the funeral home's not the beneficiary, and it's not done through a funeral home itself, there's no guarantee as to the prices that you're going to pay. What happens typically is your family walks into the funeral home, hands over the policy, and then the funeral home does what it needs to do, and hopefully, the family will have some active involvement as to what they want and what selections they want if you hadn't planned that out ahead of time. However, if you buy $7,000, which I would consider a bare minimum for a pre-need or for a final expense burial plan, you live another 20 years, prices are going to go up. How much, who knows? So it may not be enough then, whereas you could have locked it in with a pre-need plan prior to that. Underwriting is just the same. I think I mentioned this, flexible with certain health conditions. It's a simplified issue. We'll get into more of that in detail in a second. And funeral homes will in most cases take a final expense plan, especially if it's out of what's called its incontestability period. If it's non-contestable, I should say it's contestable period. That's the first 2 years of any policy, even if you've been approved 100% from the first day, like what we can do with final expense plans. And this is true of any life insurance, by the way. It doesn't matter. A funeral home isn't necessarily guaranteed that if you took this plan out yesterday and you died today, that they're going to get whatever death benefit that you applied for. Because the insurance companies are going to double check on health history in most circumstances before approving the death claim, and that sometimes can take months. But if you're past that 2-year period, then these funeral homes, it's good as money to them. They'll take it, they'll apply it towards the funeral, even if it takes a month or so to pay the death claim off if you're waiting on a death certificate, let's say. It's assured they're going to get a payout at that point, no matter what circumstances happen. So that's the difference between pre-need and final expense coverage. Now, let's talk about the pros and cons. So first of all, with final expense coverage, or with both, with pre-need, let's start with pre-need, you get peace of mind. Okay, the biggest reason people walk into a funeral home to buy a pre-need plan is because they want to take care of things in writing specifically so their loved ones don't have to think and worry and be in a state of despair, not only about your passing, but also about what would mom want? Would she want the pine box or would she want the gold-crusted oak casket with, a leather interior? A lot of people, if maybe you're one of these, you don't want a lot of money spent on a funeral home. You'd rather them have money that you've set aside for them. So having a pre-need plan allows you to go in here and pick and choose which kind of items you want so that your family doesn't have to make these hard decisions. I really think that's the number one reason why people buy pre-need, because there's some disadvantages to the plan, but this is a big one, because a lot of people who go to the funeral home and buy one of these have already gone through a death, and maybe the person they loved wasn't prepared, and they're sitting there in shock having to make these decisions between different items in a funeral that really should not have been left to them to choose, because it's a lot of details, it's a lot of emotional strife on top of emotional strife. So that's a huge thing. Peace of mind knowing that all that has to happen is you walk in as the bereaved and things are taken care of. You can focus on remembering your loved ones, not trying to piece together what would mom want, what casket, what flowers, and all that stuff. Another advantage of pre-need coverage is that it guards against inflation. So one of the biggest things with the funeral directors sell when they're in the home, or when they're talking to a prospect, is they're going to tell them, look, when you buy a pre-need plan, we're locking your prices in, okay? You're going to pick all these items, and even if there's a 100% price increase or whatever, no worries, it's locked in. You're cool. You just pay the premium. If you die before your premiums are paid up, you're totally protected because it is life insurance. It's a life insurance type of product. But even if prices on the actual component parts go up, then you're fine. So that's a big advantage too as well. Now here are some of the disadvantages of pre-need coverage. So first of all, pre-need coverage is out of final expense coverage, and then pre-need is the more expensive option. So when you sit down with a funeral director, of course it depends on your age, of course it depends on what your health is. My experience roughly is that a pre-need plan is going to cost 2 to 3 times as much as an equivalent of what you could get with final expense coverage. On top of that, especially as you get into paid up plans where you're looking at 7 years or 10 years, the amount of money that's paid into a pre-need plan usually far exceeds the amount of money of the value of the death benefit. I saw one policy where the policyholder would pay over 10 years $15,000 into the plan. Well, the death benefit value was $8,000. So that means she's paying $15,000 for a $7,000 benefit. It's like a high interest card note is what I kind of compare it to. Is that worth it or not? I mean, it just depends on what you're guarding against. If inflation goes through the roof and, we're talking like 1970 style inflation, sure. But, is that going to happen? I don't know. So I don't know if it's necessarily worth it. But it is something that is more common with the longer term 7-10-year pay plans, in my experience, seeing these pre-need plans with my clients, with my prospects. Now, what I understand, the way that you counter that is if you look at a smaller term of time to pay these things off, immediately lump sum, 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, that number is reduced. But what happens in exchange with that is that price goes up higher, right? So the insurance companies, if you're going to pay it off faster, want more money up front in the form of monthly premiums or however it is that you pay it. But your total premium in may be equivalent or less in that case. So it may be more sensible. But it all comes down, as we'll talk about, to the money that you can come up with to pay these things. Additionally, one other thing about pre-need plans I've seen is their underwriting isn't, in my opinion, as flexible as what you would see with final expense coverage. Sometimes if you can't qualify for their preferred rates, you're put on a multi-year waiting period policy. So whereas maybe with a final expense company, you could have been fully covered. And what if you die before the pre-need plan's paid up? You're not going to have the full death benefit's not going to pay out to protect for the funeral. Whereas a final expense plan, if you qualified for the example plan, whatever health issue you had, you would have been fully protected. So there's some things to consider when it comes to what your options are. Now, let's talk about the pros and cons of final expense. So first of all, final expense is just like any life insurance, just like pre-need. There's a level of peace of mind that you get knowing that you're protected, okay? And like I said, as long as you choose the right beneficiaries, as long as you're mindful that you're choosing a spouse or a loved one that will actually go through with what your wishes are, they're going to take that policy down to the funeral home and assign that to whatever the expense is, okay? So I don't think in all my years of doing this since 2011, I've done over 3,000 presentations. I've never heard, maybe a handful, less than 5 times where I've heard of a beneficiary. This person knows somebody that was the beneficiary on the plan, took the money and ran, spent it on all sorts of stuff except the cremation or except the funeral. It doesn't happen that often, and most people know well enough ahead of time which of their kids will actually do this and which ones won't. So they make sure to name the primary beneficiary, the most trusted child, or the spouse. So as long as you set this up right, you're going to be fine. Just make sure you set it up right. And the other thing, too, is you are in control much more fluidly with who the beneficiaries are in the policy itself. So, you don't have to name the funeral home as a beneficiary. Most people I see name a loved one. And that loved one doesn't necessarily have to spend all of that money with the funeral home. They can spend a portion of it. Or if you've got something set aside for the funeral, you can take that money and just give it like I said, as a legacy, or just give the money to somebody that pay through college or replace an income. There's a lot more flexibility with final expense plans than there are with the pre-need plans for other things beyond the final expense of the funeral itself. Hopefully that makes sense. Can be used for other reasons. We talked about that besides direct payment for the funeral cost. One of the biggest advantage of final expense is that it's extremely competitive on pricing. Okay, so you're going to find, like I said, the price for a pre-need plan is usually 2 or 3 times as much as what you can get for a final expense plan. So a lot of reasons why people buy final expense policies through an insurance agent instead of the funeral home is that the price is king. What you pay is the main determination for a lot of people. And most people who buy this stuff are on a fixed income. And so they want a plan that's affordable, easily affordable, fits their budget, that they'll actually keep, versus spending more than they really have and possibly risking dropping it, down the line. So that's a huge component. And then lastly, with final expense, I feel there's a lot more flexibility in a final expense product for underwriting than there is for a pre-need plan. I've seen applications where the pre-need qualifications are very onerous. Things like depression being a knockout or something that wouldn't qualify for preferred coverage to me, which is crazy. Whereas that's an all-day, totally fine thing that you can get with a final expense plan for first day full coverage. Whereas with the pre-need plan, it would have been a 2-year wait. I've seen that. And it just baffles me. But I'm sure that, a good pre-need agent was going to be able to shop around, hopefully. I don't know how well versed they are with different carriers. Some of them just work with one. Some of them work with 1 or 2. But generally speaking, the final expense insurance agent, especially the broker, usually has 5 to 10 carriers, and they pick and choose based on your health as the client. So to give you the best chance to get first day full coverage, because that's what most people want, is really peace of mind from the first day, instead of having to wait 2 years or something like that. So what do you choose? What are the final, determinations here when it comes to, okay, I see how pre-need works. I see how final expense works. What is the best for me? Again, this is experience as an insurance agent. I've been totally transparent with you. I don't sell pre-need. I know how it works generally speaking, but I don't sell it. And here's what it comes down to as my experience working with people. Generally speaking, people who have the capability to afford a higher premium and want really to lock things in should go to a pre-need or a funeral home to buy a pre-need policy. Whereas people who are not as economically capable and also feel pretty good about having somebody else be a beneficiary as opposed to the funeral home. But the key thing with is their ability to pay is not as great. They should buy a final expense policy. That's the easiest way of how I would segment this. I've seen a lot of people, they see the prices and they're shocked at what the funeral home offers. They don't make a lot of money. Or they just don't want to spend that money because they do the math. They add up all the premiums paid in each year. They see that they pay it for 10 years and they're getting a $8,000 funeral for a $15,000 price tag. And that just doesn't compute mathematically. Plus, they can't afford it. Again, that's what a lot of times it comes down to. So, bottom line, look, if you've seen a pre-need plan and it shocks you how expensive it is, then go get a final expense plan. Something's better than nothing. I did a video on this to train agents that you got to sell something affordable the other day, even if it's a smaller plan and it doesn't necessarily cover everything. God, something's better than nothing. I mean, family members are happy to have a $3,000 or $4,000 check to start a funeral than they would be to have zero and have to go out and fish fry and wash cars and pass the plate around in church and just embarrass themselves, because you weren't protected. So, something's better than nothing. And at the end of the day, it does come down to price for people on a fixed income, because what you want to do is buy a plan and keep it, how I look at it. If you're an insurance agent watching this, I'll add this too. This is exactly how I position and sell against both. You want to show and tell people who you deal with what the pros and the cons are, because some people are more appropriate to going into a PreNeed plan, and there's others that aren't. People that make $1,000 a month that don't have a pension plan, don't have savings, can they cough up $100, $150 a month for a PreNeed plan? Probably not. Final expense is a better choice. So, and I always like to let the prospect, the client choose which one is more sensible in their mind, because we want to make sure when they buy from us, they keep it and they're protected. I'm going to check for any comments or questions down here. Hey, how you doing, Dan? Glad you joined us today. If you guys have any questions as you watch through this, like I said, I invite you to leave a comment below. I love interacting with my audience, and if you're kind of wondering some clarification, kind of wondering how things work, or if I missed something out, feel free to post something below. My name is David Duford. I'm the owner and operator of 2 companies. If you're an insurance agent, I recruit agents at Final Expense Agent Mentor and train them to be successful in the final expense business. And if you're a consumer, I'm the owner and operator of Buy Life Insurance for Burial, where I help people like you find affordable final expense life insurance plans. So again, I want to thank you so much for joining me, and we will see you next time. Take care.